At dawn on April 25, 1945, on the shattered remains of a bridge over the Elbe River near the small German town of Torgau, American and Soviet soldiers met face to face. They shook hands, smiled for cameras, exchanged cigarettes and badges. The war in Europe was clearly nearing its end. Germany had been split in two. Yet 90 kilometers to the east, another battle was raging with ferocious intensity. In the streets of Berlin, Soviet troops were fighting house to house, block by block, closing in on the heart of the Third Reich. The meeting at Torgau, later remembered as Elbe Day, became a symbol of Allied unity. But it also marked something else: the end of any realistic possibility that American forces would reach Berlin before the Red Army. By the time those hands met over the Elbe, the outcome of the race for the Nazi capital had already been decided. For decades, the question has lingered. Why did the Red Army take Berlin, while the Americans stopped short? Was it a political miscalculation, a strategic blunder, or was it simply the unavoidable result of geography, logistics, and the brutal arithmetic of war? To understand the answer, we have to step back and look at the map of Europe in early 1945. In the West, Allied forces had landed in Normandy in June 1944 during Operation Overlord. From those beaches, they fought their way across France, liberated Paris, and pushed toward Germany's western frontier. The advance was not effortless. There were supply crises, the slowing grind through the hedgerows, and the desperate German counteroffensive in the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge. But by March 1945, American and British forces had crossed the Rhine River, the last great natural barrier protecting Germany from the West. It was a remarkable achievement. In less than a year, Western Allied armies had moved from the English Channel to the heart of Germany. Yet even after crossing the Rhine, Berlin was still hundreds of kilometers away. Between the Western Allies and the capital stood rivers, cities, and pockets of German resistance. Supply lines stretched all the way back to the beaches of Normandy. Every kilometer forward required fuel, ammunition, food, and coordination across multinational armies. Now shift your gaze to the east. The Red Army had been fighting the Germans since June 1941. The war on the Eastern Front was not a campaign of liberation alone. It was a war of annihilation. Entire cities had been reduced to rubble. Millions had died. By 1944, the strategic momentum had decisively shifted. In the summer of that year, the Soviets launched Operation Bagration, destroying Germany's Army Group Center and pushing westward with staggering speed. By January 1945, Soviet forces launched the Vistula-Oder Offensive. In a matter of weeks, they advanced from the Vistula River in Poland to the Oder River, just 70 kilometers from Berlin. 70 kilometers. That distance, less than a day's drive under normal conditions, placed the Red Army at the doorstep of the German capital, while Western forces were still far to the west. Geography alone tells part of the story. From the Oder to Berlin was a short, direct route across relatively open terrain. From the Rhine to Berlin was a far longer march across the breadth of Germany. The map was not symmetrical. The starting lines were not equal. But distance was only one factor. By April 1945, the Red Army had concentrated massive forces along the Oder front. Millions of soldiers, tens of thousands of artillery pieces, and vast numbers of tanks were positioned for a single decisive objective: Berlin. Soviet supply lines, though stretched, were oriented toward that goal. Their operational momentum carried them forward with urgency and purpose. In contrast, Western Allied strategy in early 1945 focused not solely on Berlin, but on destroying remaining German armies wherever they stood. The Ruhr industrial region, Bavaria, and southern Germany were all operational priorities. The goal was to collapse the German military machine as efficiently as possible, not necessarily to seize a symbolic prize first. There is also the matter of perception. Popular imagination often frames the end of the war in Europe as a dramatic race, as if American and Soviet columns were sprinting neck and neck toward the Reichstag. In reality, by the time that narrative took shape, the outcome had already been shaped by months of prior movement. The Red Army was simply closer, much closer, and positioned specifically for a final assault. When American and Soviet troops met at Torgau, they effectively sealed Germany's fate. The country was split in northern and southern pockets. Coordination between the Allies prevented accidental clashes and clarified zones of advance, but it also meant that any large-scale American thrust toward Berlin would require a deliberate change in strategy, redirecting armies that were already committed elsewhere. So as cameras captured smiles on the Elbe, the thunder of artillery echoed in the east. The question was no longer whether Berlin would fall, but who would pay the price of taking it. The stage was set by geography, by logistics, and by the brutal momentum of two converging fronts. The Red Army stood 70 kilometers from the objective. The Western Allies were hundreds of kilometers away. One side had shaped its spring offensive around Berlin. The other had shaped its strategy around destroying Germany's remaining capacity to fight. The handshake at Torgau symbolized unity, but it also marked the quiet end of the race. And that brings us to the central question that will guide this story. Was Berlin taken by the Soviets because of political choice, or because by April 1945 the logic of war had already made any other outcome almost impossible? By late March 1945, the map of Germany revealed a stark reality. American and British forces had crossed the Rhine. The German army in the west was collapsing. Bridges were falling intact into Allied hands. Columns of tanks rolled eastward with astonishing speed. To many observers, it seemed entirely possible, perhaps even inevitable, that Western troops could drive straight to Berlin and claim the ultimate prize of the European war. But inside Allied headquarters, the decision was far more complex. On March 28, 1945, General Dwight D. Eisenhower sent a message to Moscow informing Stalin that Berlin would not be his primary objective. Instead, he intended to focus on destroying German forces in central and southern Germany. This was not an impulsive choice. It was the culmination of weeks of assessment, intelligence reports, logistical calculations, and political agreements already made between the Allies. To understand why Eisenhower made that decision, we need to examine what he saw in front of him. First, there was the military estimate. General Omar Bradley calculated that capturing Berlin could cost as many as 100,000 American casualties. The city was heavily fortified, crisscrossed with canals, concrete structures, anti-tank obstacles, and defended by desperate troops who understood that defeat meant annihilation. Urban warfare was notoriously brutal. Every building could become a fortress, every street corner a killing zone. The Red Army had learned this lesson at terrible cost in Stalingrad and elsewhere. American forces had fought hard battles in places like Aachen, but nothing on the scale of a capital city defended to the last man. Eisenhower was a commander responsible not only for victory, but for the lives of his soldiers. By spring 1945, Germany was clearly losing. The industrial heartland of the Ruhr was being encircled. German armies were surrendering in massive numbers. The question was no longer whether Germany would fall, but how to end the war with the least additional bloodshed. Then there was the matter of agreements already made. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, the Allied leaders had divided post-war Germany into occupation zones. Berlin, though located deep within the future Soviet zone, was itself to be divided. But the larger region surrounding it was already designated for Soviet control. Even if American forces captured the city first, they would eventually have to hand over large portions of it to Soviet occupation. From Eisenhower's perspective, expending tens of thousands of lives for territory that would not remain under American administration made little strategic sense. Not everyone agreed.
Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery argued that a bold, concentrated thrust toward Berlin could end a war dramatically and secure political leverage in the post-war order. British Prime Minister Churchill was even more explicit. He believed whoever took Berlin would shape the balance of power in Europe. To him, the symbolic and political value of capturing the Nazi capital outweighed the projected cost. Churchill feared Soviet expansion. He understood that the armies occupying territory at the end of the war would determine the political reality of post-war Europe. In his view, halting short of Berlin risked conceding too much influence to Moscow. But Eisenhower's role was different. He was the supreme Allied commander, tasked with defeating Nazi Germany as efficiently as possible. His priority was not positioning for a future rivalry, but ending the current war. Intelligence reports suggested that German forces were attempting to retreat southward, possibly to establish a so-called Alpine redoubt in Bavaria and Austria. If that happened, the war could drag on in mountainous terrain for months. By turning south and east rather than northeast toward Berlin, Eisenhower aimed to prevent any prolonged resistance and to link up with Soviet forces along the Elbe. Destroy the remaining German armies, cut the country in half, and bring the conflict to a swift conclusion. There was also the practical issue of coordination. If both American and Soviet forces converged on Berlin simultaneously without clear boundaries, the risk of confusion or even accidental clashes would increase. Communication between the Allies existed, but trust was limited, and battlefield conditions were chaotic. Establishing a clear line of contact reduced the danger of friendly fire incidents between armies that spoke different languages and operated under different doctrines. Meanwhile, Soviet forces were already amassing for a final assault. They were closer, heavily concentrated, and politically committed to taking the city. For Stalin, Berlin was not merely a strategic objective. It was the heart of the enemy that had invaded the Soviet Union in 1941. It was the symbol of unimaginable destruction inflicted upon Soviet soil. Eisenhower understood this reality. He also understood that altering the Allied advance to compete for Berlin could strain the fragile coalition that had held together since 1941. So the decision was made. American forces would halt along the Elbe. They would focus on eliminating German resistance in the Ruhr and southern Germany. Berlin would fall within the Soviet sphere of operations. In retrospect, critics have argued that this choice shaped the Cold War. Supporters counter that no realistic alternative would have justified the cost. Even if American troops had reached Berlin first, they would have faced the same devastated city, the same fanatical defense, and the same agreement to share or transfer control afterward. By early April 1945, the strategic direction was set. The Western Allies would destroy what remained of the German war machine. The Red Army would prepare to storm the capital. The race to Berlin was no longer about speed alone. It had become a calculation of distance, casualties, politics, and alliance management. Eisenhower chose certainty over symbolism. He chose to end the war decisively rather than gamble thousands of lives for a city that diplomacy had already assigned elsewhere. And as Soviet artillery prepared to open fire east of the Oder, the consequences of that decision moved from planning rooms to the battlefield.
By April 1945, the balance of power in Europe was no longer in question. The only uncertainty was how the war would end and who would stand in the ruins of Berlin when it did. For the Soviet Union, the answer was never ambiguous. Berlin was not simply another objective on a map. It was the political heart of Nazi Germany, the command center of the regime that had unleashed unprecedented destruction across Soviet lands. Capturing it was both a military necessity and a historical reckoning. The Red Army stood just 70 kilometers from the city along the Oder River. That proximity was not accidental. It was the result of a relentless series of offensives that had begun years earlier and accelerated dramatically in 1944. During Operation Bagration, Soviet forces shattered Germany's Army Group Center advancing hundreds of kilometers across Belarus and into Poland. Entire German formations were destroyed. The Wehrmacht in the east never fully recovered. Then, in January 1945, came the Vistula-Oder Offensive. Soviet armies surged forward with extraordinary speed, moving from the Vistula River to the Oder in just weeks. German defensive lines collapsed under overwhelming artillery barrages and armored breakthroughs. By early February, forward elements of the Red Army were staring across the Oder at the last natural barrier before Berlin. Geography now favored the Soviets. The terrain between the Oder and Berlin was relatively open compared to the obstacles faced by Western forces farther west. Supply lines, though stretched, ran directly toward the German capital. Soviet logistics had been refined through years of total war, moving enormous quantities of ammunition and fuel across devastated landscapes. The objective was clear, and the entire operational system was oriented toward it. But geography alone does not explain the scale of what was about to unfold. On April 16, 1945, the final offensive began. Under the command of Marshal Georgy Zhukov and Marshal Ivan Konev, Soviet forces launched one of the most concentrated artillery bombardments in history. Thousands of guns opened fire simultaneously along the Silo Heights, the last major defensive line east of Berlin. The ground shook, the sky glowed with continuous flashes, entire sectors were transformed into craters within hours. Behind the artillery came wave after wave of infantry and armored units. Nearly 2.5 million Soviet soldiers were committed to the broader Berlin operation. Tens of thousands of tanks and self-propelled guns supported the advance. This was not a probing attack or a cautious maneuver. It was a decisive blow designed to crush resistance through sheer weight of force. There was also an element of rivalry. Zhukov and Konev both commanded powerful fronts converging on Berlin from different directions. Stalin encouraged competition between his marshals, knowing that ambition could drive momentum. Each commander wanted the honor of capturing the Nazi capital. Each pushed his forces forward with urgency. The German defenders fought fiercely, especially at the Silo Heights. The initial Soviet assaults encountered stiff resistance and heavy casualties. Minefields, anti-tank guns, and entrenched infantry slowed the advance, but the imbalance in numbers and firepower was overwhelming. Within days, Soviet troops broke through and began encircling Berlin. The Red Army's approach to urban warfare had been forged in earlier battles. At Battle of Stalingrad, Soviet forces learned how to fight in shattered cities, advancing building by building, room by room. Later, during the siege of Budapest, they refined tactics for isolating districts, cutting supply routes, and systematically reducing resistance. Berlin would be the culmination of those hard-earned lessons. There was also a psychological dimension impossible to ignore. The Soviet Union had suffered catastrophic losses, entire regions burned, millions of civilians killed, cities leveled. For many Soviet soldiers, the march into Germany carried a sense of retribution. Berlin symbolized the source of invasion and devastation. The war in the East had been existential. Victory had to be undeniable. Stalin understood the symbolic power of the moment. A Soviet flag raised over the Reichstag would not just signal military triumph, it would represent the culmination of what the Soviet people called the Great Patriotic War. The image would echo across the world. As Soviet armies closed in, German command structures disintegrated, yet resistance stiffened inside Berlin itself. Hitler remained in the city, issuing increasingly detached orders. Volkssturm units, remnants of SS formations, and hastily assembled defenders prepared for a last stand, but they faced an adversary willing to accept enormous casualties to achieve final victory. By late April, Soviet artillery was pounding the city center. Bridges were seized or destroyed, encirclement tightened. The operational design, massive concentration, relentless pressure, coordinated fronts, had worked. The Red Army had transformed geography into inevitability.
The drive to Berlin was not merely a dash fueled by ambition, it was the logical culmination of geography, operational planning, industrial mobilization, and political determination. The Soviet Union had positioned itself closer to the objective, assembled overwhelming force, and committed fully to the assault. When the offensive began on April 16th, the question was no longer whether the Red Army could reach Berlin. It was how much blood would be required to take it, and how quickly the Third Reich would collapse once its capital was engulfed in flames.
On April 16, 1945, the sky east of Berlin exploded in fire. More than 9,000 Soviet artillery pieces opened up along a narrow front near the Silo Heights, turning night into a continuous flash of orange and white. It was one of the most intense bombardments of the war. The ground trembled for hours. Entire German defensive positions vanished under steel and smoke. This was the opening of the Battle of Berlin, the final and most brutal confrontation in the European war. The Silo Heights were the last natural defensive barrier before Berlin. German forces, though battered and under strength, were well positioned on elevated terrain overlooking marshy ground. Soviet commanders believed overwhelming artillery and armored assaults would break the line quickly. Instead, the first days proved costly. Floodlights intended to blind German defenders illuminated advancing Soviet troops instead. Minefields and anti-tank guns inflicted heavy losses. Progress was measured in meters. But the Red Army had numbers, reserves, and momentum. Wave after wave pushed forward. By April 19, German defenses at Silo collapsed. The road to Berlin lay open. As Soviet forces encircled the city, the nature of the war changed. This was no longer maneuver warfare across fields and rivers. It became block-by-block combat inside a modern capital. Berlin was a city of stone apartment blocks, government buildings, canals, railway embankments, and underground tunnels. Each structure could be fortified, each intersection could become a killing zone. German defenders included remnants of Wehrmacht divisions, Waffen-SS units, Hitler Youth members, Volkssturm militia, and police formations. Many understood that surrender to Soviet forces might mean retribution for years of brutal warfare on the Eastern Front. That fear hardened resistance. Orders were issued to fight to the last bullet. Soviet troops advanced methodically. Artillery was dragged into streets for direct fire against buildings. Tanks blasted openings in walls so infantry could move through interiors rather than expose themselves in open streets. Engineers cleared barricades under fire. Snipers dominated rooftops. Flamethrowers were used to eliminate fortified basements. Every floor, every staircase had to be taken by force. Casualties mounted rapidly. Bradley's earlier prediction that urban combat would be catastrophic proved accurate, only now it was Soviet soldiers paying the price. In just over 2 weeks of fighting, the Red Army suffered more than 80,000 killed and around 270,000 wounded in the Berlin operation. Entire units were shattered in assaults measured not in kilometers but in city blocks. Meanwhile, civilians huddled in cellars as artillery shells reduced neighborhoods to rubble. Fires raged uncontrollably. Water systems failed. Electricity vanished. Berlin became a landscape of dust, smoke, and collapsing masonry. Inside the Führer bunker, Adolf Hitler refused to leave the capital. Orders were issued for phantom armies that no longer existed. Counterattacks were demanded from divisions that had already been destroyed. Reality narrowed to a few underground rooms, while Soviet forces closed in from multiple directions. By April 23rd, Soviet units had entered central districts. Bridges over the Spree were contested fiercely. Government ministries fell one by one. The Reich Chancellery area became the ultimate objective.
The symbolic heart of the city was the Reichstag. Though no longer the seat of government in practical terms, it represented the German state. Capturing it carried immense psychological weight. Soviet commanders understood this. On April 30th, assault units stormed the building under withering fire. Fighting raged inside its shattered halls. Grenades rolled across marble floors. Machine guns echoed through corridors blackened by smoke. That same day, Hitler took his own life in the bunker beneath the city. The regime he had built was collapsing above him. Late on April 30th and into May 1st, Soviet soldiers raised a red banner atop the ruined Reichstag building. The famous image that would later circle the world symbolized final victory, but it masked the chaos still unfolding below. Fighting continued in pockets across the city for several more days. Some German units attempted breakout attempts westward, hoping to surrender to American forces instead. On May 2nd, Berlin's remaining defenders capitulated. The city was silent except for scattered gunfire and the rumble of vehicles moving through debris-choked streets. The Third Reich had fallen in its own capital. The brutality of the battle confirmed why Western commanders had hesitated to commit to such an assault. Urban warfare in Berlin consumed lives at an extraordinary rate. Even with overwhelming superiority, the Red Army paid a devastating price. Yet, for the Soviet Union, the capture of Berlin carried meaning beyond the battlefield. It signified the destruction of the regime that had invaded in 1941. It marked the end of a war that had cost the Soviet people millions upon millions of lives. The red flag over the Reichstag was not merely a military achievement, it was a political and emotional climax. When the guns finally fell silent, Berlin lay in ruins. Entire districts were flattened, bridges were shattered, infrastructure was destroyed. What remained was a broken city, divided among victors. The Battle of Berlin had validated every warning about its cost. It had also fulfilled the Soviet objective with absolute clarity. The question of who would take the Nazi capital was settled not in theory, but in blood, rubble, and fire.
When Berlin fell on May 2, 1945, the military question was settled. The Red Army stood in the ruins of the Reichstag. The Third Reich had collapsed in its own capital. But almost immediately, another question began to take shape, one that historians and politicians would debate for decades. Did the Western Allies make the right decision in stopping short of Berlin? At first glance, the answer in April 1945 seemed straightforward. Germany was finished. Its armies in the West were surrendering in massive numbers. In the South, American forces were overrunning Bavaria and Austria. On May 7th, Germany signed its unconditional surrender. From a purely military standpoint, the war in Europe had ended decisively. Yet the political landscape of Europe was only beginning to shift. Prime Minister Winston Churchill quickly grew uneasy. He had long warned that the advance of the Red Army would shape the political future of Eastern Europe. As Soviet forces consolidated control over territories they had liberated or occupied, the balance of power on the continent began to change. Governments aligned with Moscow emerged across Poland, Romania, Hungary, and beyond. Churchill later reflected that the line where armies stopped in 1945 would become the frontier of influence in the post-war world. The Iron Curtain, as he would famously call it, descended along those very lines. Critics of Eisenhower's decision argue that capturing Berlin might have strengthened Western leverage in the negotiations that followed. A Western presence in the heart of Germany, they suggest, could have altered the psychological and political balance at the dawn of the Cold War. But this argument depends on hindsight. In March and April 1945, the primary objective for Allied commanders was ending the war as quickly as possible while minimizing additional casualties. General Dwight D. Eisenhower was operating within agreements made at the Yalta Conference.
Berlin lay deep within the Soviet zone of occupation, as already determined by Allied consensus. Even if American forces had seized the city first, they would almost certainly have had to withdraw from large sections of it later. There was also the human cost. The Battle of Berlin demonstrated just how violent and expensive an assault on the capital would be. More than 80,000 Soviet soldiers were killed in a matter of weeks. Urban warfare consumed manpower at an extraordinary rate. Had American and British forces redirected towards Berlin, they would have faced similar conditions: fortified buildings, determined defenders, and chaotic street fighting. Was it worth sacrificing tens of thousands of additional lives for symbolic advantage in a city that diplomatic agreements had already placed under shared but predominantly Soviet control? There was also the issue of alliance cohesion. In April 1945, the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union were still formally partners in a global war. Trust was limited, but coordination remained essential. A sudden unilateral dash to Berlin could have strained that fragile partnership at the very moment when defeating Germany required unity. And there were operational realities. American armies were already committed to encircling the Ruhr and pushing south to prevent any prolonged German resistance in the Alps. Intelligence suggested the possibility of a last-ditch defensive stronghold in southern Germany and Austria. Redirecting major forces towards Berlin would have required massive logistical adjustments, delaying other operations and potentially prolonging the war. History often tempts us with counterfactuals. What if Montgomery's proposal for a concentrated thrust had been adopted? What if American armored columns had raced northeast in early April? Could they have reached Berlin before the Soviets fully encircled it? Perhaps, but even in the most optimistic scenarios, Western forces would have arrived at roughly the same time Soviet armies were already storming the outskirts. The risk of accidental clashes between allies in a devastated urban battlefield would have increased dramatically. Coordination under fire between massive armies speaking different languages and operating under different command systems would have been dangerously complex. In the end, Berlin became both an ending and a beginning. It marked the destruction of Nazi Germany. It also marked the emergence of a divided Europe. The city itself would soon be partitioned, a physical representation of the broader geopolitical divide that followed. The iconic image of the Soviet flag over the Reichstag became a defining photograph of the 20th century. It symbolized victory over fascism. It also foreshadowed a new era of rivalry. So why did the Red Army reach Berlin first? Because they were closer. Because their entire spring offensive was designed around that objective. Because Allied agreements had already defined occupation zones. Because Western commanders chose to prioritize the destruction of remaining German forces over the symbolic capture of a capital. And because the Soviet Union, having borne catastrophic losses since 1941, was determined to claim the final victory in the enemy's heart. The outcome was not the result of hesitation alone, nor of political naivete. It was the product of geography, logistics, military calculation, alliance diplomacy, and the staggering human cost of total war. By the time American soldiers shook hands at Torgau, the race had already been decided. Berlin would fall to the army that stood at its gates and was prepared to pay the price to take it.